Long ago, in a kingdom surrounded by dark, ancient woods, there lived a powerful king named Arion. His castle stood tall on a hill, its golden spires glinting under the sun. Arion was known for his bravery and wisdom, and his people adored him. Yet, there was one part of his land that even he dared not explore, the cursed forest. One fateful day, while hunting with his guards, Orion's horse suddenly bolted into the woods. The deeper it went, the darker the forest became. His men shouted his name, but their voices faded as the thick trees swallowed him whole. The sun dipped below the horizon, and an eerie mist crept over the forest floor. As night fell, Arion dismounted, realizing he was utterly alone. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of unseen creatures. Suddenly, a cold wind swept past him, carrying a faint, haunting melody. Orion's heart pounded as he turned to see a figure emerging from the mist. It was a woman, more beautiful than anyone he had ever seen. She wore a flowing white gown that shimmered unnaturally in the pale moonlight. Her long black hair cascaded down her shoulders, and her eyes, though mesmerizing, seemed hollow, as if they hid an endless void. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice soft yet chilling, "you are far from your castle. I have been watching you for a long time. Who are you?" Arion demanded, his voice firm despite the unease crawling through him. The woman smiled, stepping closer. "I am Elira," she whispered. "I have waited for centuries to find someone like you. My love for you is eternal, my king. Will you make me your queen?" Orion's instincts screamed at him to flee. Though her beauty was enchanting, there was something deeply unsettling about her presence. Summoning his courage, he replied, "I cannot marry someone I do not know. Return to wherever you came from." Elira's smile faded. Her eyes darkened, and her voice turned cold. "You dare reject me," she hissed. "You will regret this, Arion. I will not rest until you are mine, or destroyed." The mist thickened, and the woman vanished before his eyes. Back at his castle that night, Arion tried to convince himself it was a dream. But as he stared into his mirror, his reflection disappeared, replaced by Elira's wicked smile. The curse had begun. The days that followed were filled with strange happenings. At first, King Arion believed that the encounter with Elira was nothing more than a dream, a trick of the mind. But soon, it became clear that something far darker was at play. It started with the castle itself. Late one night, as Arion sat in the royal banquet hall, the temperature suddenly dropped. The warmth of the fire in the hearth did nothing to stop the chill that crept across the room. A cold wind blew through the windows, even though they were tightly shut. Arion shivered, pulling his cloak tighter around him. Then, a soft, eerie melody echoed through the hall, the same haunting tune he had heard in the forest. It was faint at first, but grew louder, as if it were drawing closer. His heart raced. The source of the music was invisible, but it was unmistakable. The melody was coming from inside the castle. Suddenly, the large wooden doors to the hall creaked open. A figure stood in the doorway. It was Elira. Her ghostly form shimmered in the dim light, and her hollow eyes locked onto his. "You cannot escape me, Arion," she whispered, her voice cold and smooth. "I have followed you to the safety of your castle. You are mine now." Arion stood frozen in place, fear coursing through his veins. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to stay calm. Elira smiled, but it was a smile that sent shivers down his spine. "I want what is rightfully mine. Your heart, your soul, your kingdom." Before Arion could respond, she disappeared, leaving behind an overwhelming silence. The room felt colder than ever, the fire now flickering weakly in the hearth. Arion looked around, his mind racing. Was he truly losing his sanity? Later that night, as Arion lay in his bed, the strange music began again, this time closer, as if someone were right outside his chamber door. He rose cautiously and opened it, but there was nothing. Only the cold, empty hallway. Yet, as he turned to go back into his room, he saw her, Elira, standing at the far end of the hall. Her eyes gleamed in the darkness, and her lips whispered, "You cannot hide from me, Arion." The shadow of her presence haunted him, and he knew deep in his heart that she would not stop until he was hers. King Arion could no longer ignore the growing sense of dread that surrounded him. The strange occurrences had escalated, and the haunting presence of Elira followed him everywhere. Every night, the ghostly whispers and eerie music seemed to draw closer, and the once thriving castle now felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with the weight of unseen eyes. One evening, as Arian sat in his study, trying to find some way to end the torment, his royal advisor, Cedric, arrived. The old man was pale, his face lined with worry. "Your Majesty, there is something I must tell you," he said quietly. Arian looked up, startled. "What is it, Cedric?" "The spirit you have encountered is no ordinary ghost," Cedric began. "She is Elira, a woman who once lived in the cursed woods that surround this kingdom. Many years ago, she fell in love with a man who rejected her, and in her fury, she cursed the forest. She vowed that any man who dared to love her would either marry her or face death." Arian's heart sank as he listened, dread creeping up his spine. "How can I stop her?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Cedric's eyes darkened. "The only way to rid yourself of her is to confront her in the place where it all began, the cursed woods. There, you must face her with no fear, for only then can the curse be broken." Arian stood up, his hands shaking. "But if I go to her, what will happen? Will I die like the others who have crossed her?" Cedric hesitated. "I fear that is a risk you will have to take, Your Majesty. But if you are truly brave, you may survive." That night, as Arian lay in his chamber, the whispers grew louder. The cold wind blew through the cracks in the walls, and the haunting melody filled the air. Then, he heard it, her voice, clearer than ever. "You cannot hide from me, Arian," Elira whispered. "Come to the woods. Face me. Your fate is already sealed." As the moonlight poured through his window, Arian knew that he had no choice. He had to confront the ghost, or he would lose everything, his kingdom, his sanity, and his very life. The journey into the cursed woods awaited him. The night before King Arian ventured into the cursed woods, sleep eluded him. The air in his chamber felt thick, as if the very walls were closing in. The once comforting sounds of the castle had turned eerie, the creak of the floorboards, the distant echoes of voices that seemed to come from nowhere. Each passing hour heightened his unease, and he knew the time had come to face Elira. As dawn broke, Arian prepared himself. He donned his armor, his hands trembling as he strapped on his sword. Despite the fear gnawing at him, he knew he had no other choice. He could not allow Elira's torment to continue any longer. His people depended on him. The cursed woods lay beyond the castle gates, dark and foreboding, their twisted trees casting long shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. As Arian ventured deeper into the forest, the air grew colder, and the mist thickened, obscuring his vision. He could feel the weight of something watching him, something sinister lurking just out of sight. The farther he went, the more oppressive the silence became, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant howl of an unseen animal. And then, he heard it, the soft, eerie melody. It echoed through the trees, a haunting tune that sent a chill down his spine. The music was the same as before, the same that had filled his castle and haunted his dreams. Arian's heart pounded in his chest as he pressed forward, determined not to let fear control him. Suddenly, the mist parted, and there she was. Elira stood before him, her ghostly figure shimmering in the dim light. Her eyes locked onto his with a cold, unblinking stare, and her lips curled into a cruel smile. "You've come at last, Arian," she said, her voice smooth and unnerving. "I knew you couldn't resist me forever." Arian's hand tightened around the hilt of his sword. "I did not come for you," he said, trying to steady his voice. "I came to end this nightmare once and for all." Elira laughed softly, the sound like ice scraping against stone. "You think you can defeat me? I am beyond death, Arian. You are nothing but a man, a fragile soul who cannot escape my grasp." The shadows around her seemed to grow darker, swirling as if alive. Arian could feel the power of her curse pressing down on him, the weight of it suffocating him. But he refused to show fear. "I will not be yours," he said, his voice resolute. "Not now, not ever." Elira's smile faded, and her eyes glowed with fury. "Then you will perish, just like the others before you." The ground trembled beneath them, and the air turned cold as death itself seemed to draw near. The final confrontation had begun. The air in the cursed woods grew unbearably cold, and the mist swirled violently around King Arian as he stood before Elira. The weight of her curse pressed against him, but he stood tall, refusing to let fear take hold. The ghostly woman's eyes gleamed with a terrifying intensity, and her form seemed to shift, as though she were both there and not there at the same time. "You cannot escape me, Arian," Elira hissed, her voice like the cold wind, cutting through the silence of the woods. "You belong to me. You always have." Arian's hand tightened around the hilt of his sword, his knuckles white. He had come to this place to end the nightmare, and he would not leave until he had done so. His heart beat fast, but his resolve remained unbroken. "I will not be yours," he said firmly, his voice steady despite the dread that twisted in his chest. "You may haunt me, torment me, but you will not have my soul." Elira's laughter echoed through the trees, chilling and hollow. "You think you have the power to reject me. I am eternal. I am the curse of these woods, and you cannot fight that which has no end." The shadows around them seemed to come alive, swirling and writhing like dark, twisted creatures. Arian could feel them closing in, pressing on his chest, suffocating him. But he stood firm. With every breath, he gathered strength. In that moment, something inside him shifted. He remembered the words of his advisor, Cedric, "Face her without fear." Fear had held him captive for too long, and now he would not let it rule him any longer. With a roar, Arian charged at Elira, his sword raised high. But as he swung it, she vanished into the mist, her laughter still echoing in the air. "Is this your strength, Arian?" she taunted. "You cannot defeat me. I am everywhere. I am the wind, the shadows, the very earth beneath your feet." The ground trembled beneath his feet, and the trees groaned as if they were alive. Arian spun around, his heart racing, as Elira's ghostly form appeared before him again. But this time, something had changed. The darkness that surrounded her seemed to waver, flicker, and weaken. "You are not eternal," Arian said, his voice now filled with certainty. "You are bound by your own curse." With a final, defiant cry, Elira reached out toward him, but her form began to fade, her power crumbling as the truth sank in. Arian stood tall as the shadows around her disappeared, leaving nothing but an empty space where the ghost had once stood. The curse had broken. Elira was gone, and the woods fell silent. The mist cleared, and the light of the moon shone brightly on Arian. He had won.